All right, teaching a class for which event?
Amtgard online.
Okay, teaching class for the Amtgard online event. I am BigHead. I use he/him pronouns. This is FARIX.
I use he, him as well.
Yeah, my lovely assistant for this because I can't do things on my own. So the idea for this class is to kind of cover the tall fighter perspective, and then additionally with a bit of like height mismatch tips is really the idea. So to jump right in, because we have limited storage space, some of the advantages that tall fighters are going to have are obviously range, right? There's a relatively long range where I can threaten my opponent, and my opponent cannot threaten me back. As a taller fighter, as a fighter with better range, which can be achieved through equipment, not just through height. But as a fighter with longer range, you really kind of self-explanatorily want to sit in this range as much as possible. Your opponent, though, is going to know that they can't let you sit at that range, and they're going to do what they can to either be outside of that range or inside of that range for as much of the fight as they possibly can. So some of the things that you're going to want to do are to be able to identify that range, which then I can't really teach you much there. That's just something you're going to have to figure out on your own. And also how to disengage so you can reset to that range, because that is pretty critically important. Outside of that, which we'll get to when we start doing some of the more practical stuff, tall fighters have something that I feel like doesn't get talked about a whole lot, which is the ability to I mean, everyone has this ability, but tall fighters have it to a greater extent, the ability to sacrifice range for angle, right? So right here, I can make contact with FARIX's shoulder with a straight extension, right? Which means that at this range, I can hit him in the shoulder, but I have no additional angle that I can put on it without being now out of range on that spot, okay? So what that means is that as we get closer, I can start sacrificing that range, because I no longer need my maximum range to hit him here, to get a wider angle. This is going to allow me to do things like get around blocks and start hitting more awkward angles for him to put an active defense on. So you should have seen this before, but I mean, Ben, if you just want to throw up like a normal house guard for up here, right? So here, I can, with a little bit of difficulty, get either the shoulder or close to the shoulder, whereas here, assuming that I survive getting this close, I can hit him in the back with a relatively similar angle, right? So we'll do the other shoulder since it's closer to the camera. So here, right, it gets more difficult the closer, as I get more offset from it, and here, I can go there, I can lean into it, I can start hitting really, really wide angles by just losing some of the range that I have naturally, whereas Ben is going to have a very hard time with his somewhat shorter arms and significantly shorter stick, hitting me in those same angles from this distance. So that is one of the key advantages that really should get kept in mind. It works. One of the other things to really keep track of is that it is really, you're talking about distance from the shoulder. So chest to chest distance is nice and all, right? And that's usually a good measuring tool. But the fact of the matter is that here I've got just barely enough range to touch Ben's shoulder and nowhere that I can hypothetically make contact anywhere else. Back here, I can't hit anywhere, but if Ben were to take a normal guard, and I were to drop my shoulder closer to him without moving my feet, I can start doing things like hitting money shots and things of that nature. So here, my opponent might think I'm out of range, but you can get nice little shots like that. And as a tall fighter, you can surprise people with that a lot, and it actually does get a lot of good kills. All right, so going into a little bit of like the disengagement type stuff, what I want to avoid as a taller fighter is getting into the shot exchanges and the like the block strike sort of fights that a lot of times shorter fighters are much better at, the more compact frame, you could say, lends itself to a lot faster shots and a lot closer in defense. I've got a lot more real estate that can be hit, and I've got a slower return than my opponent. So I don't want to sit here and get into a position where I'm going to throw a shot, he's going to throw a shot, and then we start doing this sort of thing, because I'm going to lose that fight very quickly for a number of reasons. So if it looks like it's getting that direction, if I've kept him at range and he closes in to the point that I can no longer do that, one of my absolute favorite things to do for disengagement is to throw a good chop right across to the sword shoulder, ideally something that has an angle that forces him to block far off to the side, right? And as I do that, I'm going to step as hard away from that shoulder towards shield size I can, okay? So as my opponent presses in, I go here, right? And a lot of times your opponent is going to, at that point, kind of reset and reassess the situation. They don't want to push into a situation as you're moving laterally and have good range and are setting up distance there. So you get them to reset a lot of times out of that, and then you try again. Hopefully you can kill them before they get to that point. It's not something that's going to work a bunch of times in a row. You're going to get it once or maybe twice a fight, depending on the experience level of your opponent. And then outside of that, they're going to go, okay, no, not getting away this time. They're going to kill you. So something to keep track of. It is in no way a silver bullet, but it is really nice. Now, how to prevent your opponent from closing is going to be kind of a key thing here. So let's talk about how to maximize the use of these sorts of the range that I've got where I can affect my opponent and they can't affect me. One of what I consider to be like the secret shot of the tall people is a lot of times an opponent will just kind of charge you, right? They decide that jockeying for distance control is not their thing anymore, and they're just going to rush in. Okay, assuming that they aren't advancing the way that Ben just did, they are going to have to run where they're going to move one leg in front of the other instead of a series of advances with the front leg. So what you're going to want to do if you have the distance control for it is, as your opponent comes into range, you want to set it up so that they take their step into range with their shield leg, right? So this is the ideal point for it. Come across and hit them in the knee there. Every opponent that is charging full tilt is going to not want to give up the advantage of having gotten within range, okay? So as you hit this leg, they're going to take a step forward with that back leg, and as they're dropping, because this is very difficult to do in slow motion, as they're dropping, almost everyone is going to throw a hip wrap, because that is the shot to take when you are hitting the knee and extending out at an opponent, right? You should have seen it a number of times on ditches. It's really very common if you look for it. It's largely thrown as reflex. So if my opponent is advancing, I back up and take there, he starts to throw out, I know he's swinging for that hip, and if I've got a sword in this hand, if I've got a punch shield in this hand, if I've got a strap shield in this hand, it should work very similarly to get that block and simply throw across. There's not a whole lot of actually surviving that if you time it correctly and your opponent throws a shot that they want to throw off of reflex. This will work pretty consistently until people acknowledge the fact that throwing shots out of reflex on you as a taller fighter is a bad decision, and at that point they'll start getting hit. They'll go, "Ugh," and they'll lower themselves down without actually throwing shots.
You want to do that same thing to turn around so they can see
Yeah.
the hip wrap in motion.
Okay, so if you just want to come on in here, here, right? It's relatively natural motions. This sort of thing should be very practiced by any sort of veteran fighter. I'm going to switch again so the sun's out of my eyes because you have ball cap. But yeah, this is a shot that should work relatively consistently, especially against like mid-tier fighters who are good enough to recognize that they don't want to lose the momentum that they've gained by charging in, but aren't experienced enough to know that they're going to get killed doing what they're doing. So that one is always one of my favorites. Now, as far as actually getting in the grind here, I prefer to open my opponent's defense up with faking. This is, I mean, a huge part of my fighting style. But because I have the height advantage, because I have the distance advantage, it allows me to throw that quarter shot followed by a full shot without my opponent being able to return, because they're still closing during the initial part. So, to be perfectly frank, I don't have a whole lot of of expanding on that, except I guess we can go into what a good fake is, but that feels like an entirely separate video in a lot of ways.
Yeah, for sure.
If you would like, the Rising Winds Digital Classroom has a single short sword class by me, where I go into this in some amount of depth. So go ahead and check out that video as far as like what a good fake is. But in very, very short detail, if you talk about Quadrant Theory, what the easiest way of addressing it without going into anything real complicated is that good fakes tend to be from one quadrant to the opposite quadrant. Sometimes it'll be one quadrant to an adjacent quadrant, but there are problems with that. Now the fact that every quadrant is either adjacent or opposite of every other quadrant is going to make things a little bit more difficult to pick up there. But again, that video will go quite a bit more in depth about it. So Ben, if you want to go into like how to successfully close at this point, if you're against an opponent that has longer range.
So if you're talking about closing, sword and board is a good way to do it. I think actually we'll start with single sword though. So if you're talking about closing, there's really two ways of closing in my mind. There's the direct path, which is get in close. Don't hide what you're doing necessarily, but make sure you're blocking, returning, and fighting your way in. The other way is the more indirect way. This takes longer and is generally considered boring by most people. But it is another way of bringing your opponent closer to you rather than you forcing your way towards them. So the direct way is pretty simple. What you want to do is you either want to elicit a response from them, so hit them on the hand, bring it in. You want to get that block in first, and then counter on the motion. You can also just walk towards them, get that sword to swing, throw the hand block, come in, but you just want to make sure as you're going in, you have a plan other than just hit them, because that's either going to Simo or I'm simulating the shorter person here today. You're not going to have the same reach that they do, so 9 times out of 10 they're going to hit you before I can even get a good solid body shot in. You're either going to walk into a stab or you're going to get caught on the top rack somewhere. The more indirect way, we're probably going to have to move around for this a little bit, is you want to trick them visually with your footwork into getting closer to you, which sounds really complicated, but if you think of it, it's just kind of a game of, what's the game with the rope? Tug of war? Yeah, tug of war. But you're using distance as your measurement of success. So what you would do is you would fake like you're going in, he backs up, and then you back off. Try and bring it closer. Do it again. He backs off again. Relax. Try and bring him closer. Play with his sword a little bit. Look open. Wait for that push, and then block, counter, go in. And you don't even necessarily need the block counter, because if you can manage the range correctly, you can get him to swing on you while he's out of range, or at least throw a fake from out of range. And you can just return with a single shot, either at his arm to counter his motion, or if he swings, I can throw my block into a shot and do both of the same motion, which is called a stop hit for people who are unfamiliar with that motion. That's really the two ways of closing in my mind, is to bait them closer to you or to force your way through their defenses into where you make them uncomfortable.
So in very short, either advance on them or convince them to advance on you,
right,
and then counter advance?
Yeah, and everyone's body language, fighting style, and everything is completely different. So however you achieve those goals is pretty much up to you. Whether you want a hand block, whether you want a sword block, whether you want to stick your head in the way, whatever works.
Please don't. We don't advocate that here.
No, for sure. And then something you do have to be careful about with closing with less reach is what Tim was talking about earlier with the shot angles, up, and on the back being a lot easier to manage being a tall person with a longer sword than a shorter person with the same length sword in this simulation. So as you move in, even if you block their first one, if they throw a second one to the same quadrant, so throw a chop and then throw a round. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So if I'm coming in, he throws his first one, he blocks, he gets to he can still throw a second one in that time. So instead of advancing in a straight line, what you would do to counter that specific double up is as you come in, get the first block, step off to the side, typically away from whatever quadrant their sword came at. So if he swings on this side, I want to block, back off, hit. He swings at that side, block, back off, strike. And you don't have to necessarily go straight left, straight right. You can go forward and off to the side to create a different angle.
Okay, let's do that one.
Yeah. So forward and left. And then I'll do forward and right.
All right, sure.
Yeah. So yeah. And definitely when closing, losing a limb is not the end of the world. Pursue that fight until the bitter end and don't give up your range, because being smaller, that is one of the hardest things to gain is the range.
Yeah.
Getting in where you want to be rather than where they want to have you.
Now, having said that, if someone is advancing on me, one of the things that I absolutely will do is if I can take that first limb, one of the things I'm going to want to do then is throw a disengagement shot. Unless I can immediately pick up a quick kill, if it looks like my opponent is doing anything clever whatsoever, then coming out of taking that limb, throwing up here and disengaging, means that his closing just got significantly more difficult than it did before, because it's not, okay, I need to get close enough, I can lose a limb, I can go in here. Now that he has to worry about getting hit in the arm, chest, knees, everywhere, and it's a whole lot of block to try to cover while trying to close that distance. At that point, I don't think I've ever seen you do the direct close unless you're there. Like, once you lose a limb, I think I've always seen you do like, okay, and please come to me, please come to me.
Yeah, typically, definitely, at least in my fighting style, after the limb is lost, I try and bring them back to me, because I feel more comfortable blocking their lunge than I do lunging in and blocking and returning without losing any limb or taking any hits going into that. So I guess when you're closing, as far as like footwork goes, you have, your step in, get close to them over time. You have straight up lunge, catch yourself. There's many different kinds of lunges. That's on you. But so if you're lunging in, typically the person will try and hand block and throw a response, correct?
Yeah.
So if you lunge in and they can hand block and counter, they pretty much will. So typically you want to, and I've done this before, you can throw fakes with your body and with your footwork that will try and bait that hand block out of them. So if you come in and you're one to lunge, you can stutter like this. You see where that hand block is, so then you can throw the real lunge. Get your hand in between his sword and anything else on you, and throw where his hand is not, or his hand, elbow, arm, whatever, is not. So you can land that kill strike. Yeah, and then that pretty much goes back into like reading your opponent and throwing good fakes, which are things that you have to pick up on your own, and Tim has a video on the Rising Winds event.
I mean, other than that, when talking about maximizing using that range, doubling back to that one a little bit, this is going to sound really cheesy, and I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of boos over the internet about this, but with anything other than single sword, don't be afraid to take a leg. If you have the range advantage, cutting your opponent's mobility out of the equation is one of the absolute easiest things you can do to make sure that you don't get charged down. There are absolutely still like risks associated with fighting a legged person, but
definitely comes in more with strap shield.
Yeah, so if I'm fighting my opponent and I'm not able to get the kill from the outside, their defense is solid, I will absolutely just take that leg and scoot away. We're kind of at the end of the camera frame here, but take that leg and scoot away, and at this point I can somewhat comfortably maintain my range where I can attack my opponent, and it's very, very difficult for them to close to a range where they can do much other than counter-strike. When we've identified the fact that he's only going to be swinging for my arms, and I can be swinging for other things, it becomes a fight that goes very, very much in my direction. It's my fight to lose at that point. And a talented fighter will make you lose that fight. Don't get complacent there. But again, going into, I can now counter-strike against my opponent, just the same as they're trying to do with me. I can alpha strike my opponent. I can take the other leg against my opponent. I have a number of different win conditions, and they really are reduced to trying to time out my shot and hitting me in the forearm. So that is something people will probably complain about it. There are certain kingdoms where that's not a commonplace thing whatsoever. In fact, a lot of the normal type of fighting disallows leg shots. But where I'm from, that is an absolutely okay thing to do, and that's something that I make frequent use out of. So a legged opponent is not able to charge you down. You are able to play a lot more with the range control against a legged opponent than you are with a standing opponent.
Yeah.
So
I mean, it goes the other way too. Like if you get in there, you get the range, and they're not budging. You're trading. There is nothing wrong with deciding like, okay, I've tried, and that's it. And then you don't have to do the closing again. Like if
the closing is significantly easier.
Right. Like if you get to the point, I mean, you could even open with a leg shot if you want to, but typically that requires some setup. But if you get into the grind and you don't feel comfortable there anymore, and back up. Nothing wrong with that.
That is absolutely fair. Yeah, as the taller fighter against a competent short fighter, you don't want to be legged because there's not a whole lot of fun that's going to happen there.
Yeah.
You don't have the ability to disengage anymore. You don't have the ability to maintain the distances that you want to maintain, and they are going to very easily be able to slip into the exact fight that you don't want to be in. So yeah, that definitely works both ways. It will be harder to achieve with the shorter range fighter. I don't get hit in the legs very often because I'm very paranoid about getting hit in the legs. And most of the times when people get close enough to consistently land leg shots on me, they're probably close enough to consistently land other shots as well. But there are other fighters with better active defense and things of that nature. So like yeah, that's something very much to keep in mind. Yeah, we had just kind of said, I don't know if it'll make it in the final cut or not, that flow is really just kind of single sword times 2. There is a little bit of an exception to that as the taller fighter. This is something that I saw demonstrated a very long time ago by a fighter known as Big Zig, which is not a name that honestly many of you are likely to have heard at this point. But he was a fighter who was 6'5"-ish and very, very lanky. And watching him fight, he would be on ditch fields, and I don't do this as often as I probably should, but instead of getting in and setting up big fakes and shots like that, he just kind of sat back, cocked his swords up, and started throwing wide outside shots over people's defense as they closed on him. And he was very fast, he was very precise. It is absolutely a fighting style that means that whereas a lot of Florentine fighters are worried about how to keep themselves alive, if you have 2 swords that outrange anything your opponent is trying to do, you can make it very, very difficult for them to close. In that particular way, it is very similar to single sword times 2, but the particular advantages that are associated with longer range get applied, I feel like, more than just the times 2 bit there. Unless your opponent is aggressive in closing, which will be very, very difficult on something like a ditch field, then that is something that you should be able to get wins on, get kills on. So just something to consider. It's something I advocate other tall fighters to try out, is just kind of sit back and throw big outside angles while they're closing in a way that is difficult to do with single sword, because if you start to throw big angles, your opponent's just going to close with you. So, you want to...
To that point, if you are the shorter fighter in that situation, what I would advise is you definitely want to bait, like we were talking about, bait out shots, make sure it's safe before you go straight in. We call it checking for traps. So if you see him back there ready to go, or he's got something that you can tell is going to be a shot, or maybe you've died to it 3 times already and you're not ready to die to it this time, so you want to find what range elicits that response and get inside. Honestly, when you're closing, forcing the shots to go outside by keeping a tight guard inside and then only moving out when you have to isn't a terrible idea. That doesn't always work for stabs, but if he has, if he's trying to take those outside lanes advantage by having longer arms and throwing rappier shots, if you maintain that close center guard and just block out as they come, you can close in fairly easy. But the better the fighter, the quicker they are to change things up, so that's not a golden rule by any means.
Just like every other rule in Amtgard, your mileage will vary.
I would say as a small fighter, one of the things that I've found important in closing and getting that range is you want to take up space. You want to get in his space and either bait something out or just try and make him uncomfortable from a little bit farther away. Because the closer you are, the closer you hold your swords together, the more free reign you're giving him over this middle ground in between you. But if my arms are extended, I'm like out and ready to go. Even if he knows I can't hit him, he still has to respect that I can step in and hit him from when my arms are extended and I'm ready to go. Whereas if I'm here, any shot he throws or starts to throw, I am timing it as he's throwing it, and he's probably going to get there first.
Yeah, so, going into that, that is also a very good concept to keep in mind as the taller fighter. There are a couple of different things that you can be doing with your range, and one of the things that I will do relatively frequently is try to disguise that range a little bit. So I very frequently crouch so that I'm eye to eye with my opponent, and a lot of times I'll keep my sword in once I get involved in a fight so that it's harder to gauge where the danger zones and the safe distances are for my opponent. Now, outside of that though, if I'm beginning a fight, one of my usual starting stances is something like this, which is an almost identical concept to what FARIX was talking about earlier, which is I want to eat up as much space as I can because my opponent has to address the fact that I can passively stab him in the chest before he can affect me, basically. Now, a lot of times people look at that and go, oh, we'll just hit him in the arm. Well, the arm is the absolute easiest thing in the world to defend in this because all I have to do is pull it straight back to my shoulder, and there's no shot that he could be using to attack the arm that is not either dodged or blocked by coming straight back to the shoulder. But a lot of times I'll start off a fight like this, so I'm the same eye level as my opponent. My sword is out, so it's displaying my range, but then as we start to go, I'll start to pull my range in, and that a lot of times will throw someone off. Their eyes get big, their optimism starts flaring up, and unless they are ready for the fact that I can explode out of that to lose my range for angle, then you can get good kills on that. Both of them have their place. Learn to use both, because if you just stick with one, you are leaving out very, very large and important parts of like the back and forth of fighting that you will want against a lot of opponents.
And then what he was talking about with taking up space and getting your gear in their face. If you've ever used a punch shield or like seen a class on a punch shield before, a lot of the times they'll talk about baiting out by putting it out there as far as you can get and then stepping into it. And that's the same general like principle, is you're getting your immediate engagement out there as soon as possible, and then you can bait and return. So I mean, it works the same way. If you're gonna come in here, if I'm baiting the arm, he swings, hand block. Same basic principle. You're risking your arm or whatever you're putting in front of yourself in order to try and gain an advantage.
Yeah. And this is going to actively act as bait. If my opponent really wants to commit to that arm shot, it's relatively easy for me to return back and go into this. But if they are fast enough to pull it off, yes, the exposed area is the exposed area. so I mean, and obviously a lot of this gets sort of built into the chess game of fights between two fighters that have a vague idea of what they're doing. So yeah, I mean, anytime you're taking up space, you are also extending your vulnerabilities in certain ways. So definitely keep track of that. Sitting there and be like, okay, so always keep my equipment as far from me as possible should not be the takeaway from this class, or from literally anything else, because it's not a good idea. Or at least when it is a good idea, you have to recognize the shortcomings of it.
Yeah, for sure.
So.
And honestly, I think the biggest thing that helped me as I was trying to learn and find things out through trial and error coming up is honestly, if I was going to do a bait like that, I would literally take notes afterwards. Like, it worked on person A, but person B did this thing. It's really nerdy, but
you really are Midoriya. I realized that. It took me this long. Anyway.
But honestly, when you have like that little note to look back on, you can try and draw some conclusions based on why that worked, whether it's the person's height, the person uses long swords, whatever it is, whatever you want to try and associate with that loss or with that not working in that particular instance. There's a lot of things you can start to pin down about why things are and aren't working for yourself. And honestly, that's kind of the biggest advice I would give anyone who wants to get better, is just take notes.
Find out not only what does and doesn't work, but why it does and doesn't work.
Yeah.
That is usually an important part of things. But one that really doesn't get talked about a whole lot.
For sure.
So, yeah. I mean, other than that, I feel like we covered the majority of what I feel like should be covered. So going into effective fakes, this is going to go into kind of a couple of weird spots, but Amtgard fighting videos do that sometimes. So the human body wants to move in certain ways, or more to the point, it can only move in certain ways. Muscles have a push function and a pull function, and they have a paired muscle that does the opposite thing. Like, this is all just kind of basic physiology. So the trick here, the reason that the difference in my mind between good fakes and bad fakes are what causes a push motion to need to turn into a pull motion to achieve a successful block. So having said that, if I were to attack my opponent's sword side shoulder, that is generally a pull motion towards the shoulder. So a good fake is anything that goes from that pull motion into a push motion that they have to reverse their muscles out from. So going sword side shoulder into here is going to be something that's hard for my opponent to keep track of. The fact of the matter is that with just single sword, going towards that shoulder, everything outside of that shoulder is a push function from there. So you have a lot of free real estate if you can get your opponent to bite into that block. If you want to grab the strap shield, it honestly will probably be easier to demonstrate with that.
You want me on this side, I guess?
Yes, please, so that way I can see. So going into it with a strap shield, it's going to be a bit different, right? So if I go for the sword side shoulder and my opponent is blocking with the shield, right, that is a push motion across their face, which is really quite choice by itself. But rolling that wrist over and going for that side is going to be difficult for my opponent to keep up with unless they are familiar with the fact that I'm going to throw that shot. However, if I were to attack my opponent's, we'll rotate this way, if I were to attack my opponent's sword side shoulder and then go into a hip, it is easy for him to push into a push motion to get that block without really having to do a whole lot of extra stuff. The goal is to essentially move your equipment and your opponent's equipment and then to race to the actual spot that you're going for. So the big thing here is that your shot should be an extension of your first motion, and it should be a reversal of your opponent's first motion. And that's how you're going to get good mileage out of fakes. So having said that, we're going to go into a couple more. If my opponent is the type to block his knees with his shield, right, I can drop into here, okay, and an extension of my motion of going forward like this, I can rock forward on my knees and shoot for that with very little extra motion on my part, whereas for my opponent to reverse out of that, it is going to be dropping with a push and then reversing up with a pull, and that's going to be very, very difficult for them to get both of those motions out of the way before I flow from one motion to the next. So again, that one really requires an opponent who blocks their shield with their legs, which is why so many good shield fighters will say, like, just defend your legs with your legs. You don't want your shield to go out of position for a knee, right? So we'll go into a couple more though. Things like faking up here into there. If your opponent pulls upwards, it's going to be difficult for them to push down. Now, it's not a huge motion, so that's not one that's going to work a ton of times. If I'm going to throw that one, usually I'm going to choke up on my sword. I'm going to come in, and I'm going to come in like that, okay? So I want to raise up just enough to get his shield up, and then race down in a way that is going to get his muscles to take their time reversing. This is all going to happen very fast, and what you're really looking for are the advantages of portions of a second, right? I mean, like, this is all going to happen incredibly quickly. Fakes that I used to throw that really no longer work in the fighting meta are things like going up, faking the wrap out here into the wrap there. The fact of the matter is that now people use their feet so that when I fake a wrap out here, they can step towards it, they can step away from it, but very few people are going to stand there and let you take big outside wraps without trying to do something to punish you for it. And if they use their feet to do that, then your follow-up shot doesn't work. But yeah, that's kind of the general thing. The fact of the matter is that there are about 100 great sorts of fakes you can throw, and about 1,000 that just don't get the mileage that you're going to want out of them. And that the difference between the two is really how you set up your initial shot. If I take a big motion to set up my initial shot and have to reverse my motion a lot for a second shot, then it's not going to do a whole lot, even if I set up my opponent's push-pull reaction correctly. Even if I go opposite quadrants, I'm not achieving much if I have to do the same sorts of going from a push into a pull myself. Then we're now racing, and I've hobbled both of us in a similar way. So that you're not going to get high percentage kills out of that. So that's sort of the short version, relatively long version.
Two things that play into that. Can you grab your little punch real quick?
Yeah. I can use a strap too if it's better for demonstration.
No. This one will work better with the punch.
Got it.
So when he was talking about the push-pull motion, that's one way to think. That is a good way to think about it, and that's very helpful with the way that I see it, which is you have 3 muscles in your arm, so you have 3 different potential axes on which to fake. You have your shoulder, your elbow, and your wrist / forearm. So if you want to, you can fake whatever you want with your shoulder. So at this point, the only thing I'm committed to is top shelf. I can go there, I can go there. So if I go here, the only thing I'm committed to now is that top shoulder as a shot. But my wrist and my forearm haven't decided yet. So you can go here if he doesn't buy it. Here if he does, then he should buy it. If he doesn't, then you can back up instead of doing it. But what I'm saying is you have 3 points at which you can commit to a shot, or 3 points in which you think you can change your shot. Same thing with the hips. You can fake there. So obviously I'm faking low. I can go that hip. I can, or actually, sorry, this is the side. So this motion is that shoulder or this hip. So if you fake there, he comes down, you can use your elbow, throw it back like that. Typically you block with that as well. But even if I did that with my elbow, I can still, and he comes back up, I can still use my wrist to change it back into something that hits him with that part of the motion.
Stupid 32-inch swords.
Yeah, but you have 3 axes on which to use your fake and to think of fakes. Honestly, I think of it just like Legos. When I'm building a fake, I can have this, this, and this, and you can kind of mix and match from the bucket as you please. There was another thing. Oh, the other thing that was coming in was range controls. He was talking about pushing and pulling And you are going to get a much stronger reaction when you are this close to someone with much less fake, because from here, he can pretty much hit me in the back without moving his hand too far out of line with his body. You know what I'm saying? Just
Oh yeah, I mean,
yeah, exactly. So he doesn't have to come halfway across my body in order for me to get to here. All he has to do is move his hand in front of his shield, and if I think he's going up there, I'm moving, and he has time to change to something else. This is typically where I prefer the shorter sticks, is if we can get into this shield touchy range, because I can fake there and then come back down here without having the extra 6 inches or so on my stick to get in the way of me changing my angles at the last second.
yeah, slowing it down.
Yeah, yeah.
So, all right.
I think that's about it.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully there's half an hour's worth of usable video
Yeah, I
that we
think
can cut together. So I guess outro, that was FARIX and BigHead's online class on height advantage and height, or I guess height disparity, and then a little bit of faking involved.
Yep.
So,
Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.
Hopefully it's usable.